Right by Them, a Magnus Archives fanfiction written by Esperosis and read by Ibis Podfic. Chapter 14. Tale of a Field Hospital. Content warnings include canon typical corruption nonsense, blood, gore, body horror, near-death experiences, paranoia, creepy behavior. There was someone in the room with him. That was the only thing John knew when his consciousness returned to him. He was in a dark room, strapped down, with a wall of machines all around him. They were all beeping and humming and whirring as wires and tubes and sensors were strapped to his body, desperately fighting to keep his withering body alive. It wouldn't work. His body was giving up on him faster than the machines could preserve him. He was dying. He'd only last another 5 hours at this rate, and then he'd be gone. It was a losing battle, and part of John just wished they'd untether him and let him die. Being alive hurt so much. Someone was by the side of his bed. He knew, could feel them, their presence, their body heat. He couldn't open his eyes, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to. They reached out to him and carefully removed the mask strapped over his mouth and nose. John immediately began to gasp and choke as the machine was no longer breathing for him. He coughed and desperately tried to get his lungs to work as he began to suffocate. The man hushed him, and soon he felt cold glass pressed against his lips. He grimaced and tried to turn his head, gritting his teeth. A hand grabbed around his jaw and forced his mouth open, forcing the long glass vial into his mouth. "Drink it," Elias told him. John tried to spit it back up. Elias released the hand from John's jaw, no longer forcing it open as he removed the now empty vial and firmly clamped his hand over John's mouth, sealing his lips shut. John tried turning his head from one side and the other, desperate to shake off Elias's hand. Elias only sighed, his hand not moving an inch as he pinched his nose shut with his other hand. John tried to shake him off, tried to get up, tried to fight Elias off as the man calmly smothered him to death. He couldn't. He was trapped, he couldn't breathe, and whatever it was Elias poured into his mouth was still there. It tasted like blood. He was tired of the taste of blood in his mouth. He trembled uncontrollably as he whimpered, but Elias continued to hold his mouth and nose shut. It wasn't a choice John made consciously. Eventually, his body simply reacted to the need to breathe and swallowed the liquid. He regretted it immediately and hoped that, for once, his body would do as he wished it, and he'd be sick again, purging whatever it was from his body before it could hurt him. John immediately released his mouth and nose, and John tried to gasp for air, but he couldn't. His lungs spasmed, but no air drew into his lungs. His head swam as he ran out of air, his mouth wide open as his throat constricted. Then the mask was reattached to his face, and he could breathe again. John didn't gasp. He couldn't. But the feeling of air entering his body once more was almost euphoric as he melted back into his bed, weak and exhausted. "You've done well so far, John," Elias whispered, brushing a sweaty strand of hair off of John's face. "You're going to be perfect." John couldn't even think of a reply before he fell back into unconsciousness. The next time John woke up, he couldn't muster enough energy to do much of anything, so instead he lay there, half awake, half asleep, floating in exhausted, painless oblivion. The only thing tethering him to the world was the feeling of laying on a soft bed and the persistent beeping of machines around him. He was in the hospital. He was alive, something he had admittedly not been expecting. Damn it, he had played right into Elias's hands. He should have guessed this was going to happen after he evaded being marked by the corruption by Jane Prentice. Of course, Elias would come up with something else, and of course, he wouldn't have poisoned him with a lightner if he hadn't had some kind of cure. God, that was probably some kind of flesh thing. Was he marked by that too now? No, he wasn't scared of the liquid. Not really. He was scared of Elias and whatever he wanted with him. He wasn't marked by the flesh, but he definitely was marked by the corruption. Damn it all. He had really screwed this up, hadn't he? He should have been more careful. He should have had his guard up that Elias would try something after the Prentice attack failed. He should have been more aware of his surroundings. He shouldn't have called out to Tim, Sasha, and Martin. Elias would have saved him. He wouldn't have let John die. John should have waited it out. Now the three of them were traumatized, and it was all John's fault. God, he hoped they were okay. "Tim," Sasha's voice broke into his thoughts, and John realized he wasn't alone in the hospital room. "Please tell me what you're thinking." The silence stretched for a long moment before John finally heard Tim's voice, low and angry, the tone so similar to how Tim talked after not Sasha that John nearly flinched. "Someone did this to him." This wasn't an accident, Sasha," Tim burst. "There's no fucking way this was an accident. Those pages, the ones with the lightner, someone put them in that stack of papers on purpose, Sasha." "I know, Tim." "And don't try to tell me," Tim started again before stopping and inhaling sharply. "Wait, you know?" "There's no way this was an accident," Sasha agreed, her voice grim. "Someone tried to kill John." "Seems like a running thread nowadays," Tim spat. The silence stretched again, the beeping sound pounding in John's ears. Finally, Tim spoke again. "I'm not losing him, Sash." "We're not," she corrected him, and there was more silence. "The way I see it, we've got 2 solid suspects, and a pretty nebulous one so far," Sasha continued after a moment. "Elias is number 1. I don't know what possible motivation he could have. I don't like him." "No argument here," Tim said. The nebulous one is some sort of supernatural creature. Seems like there's quite a few interested in the archivist. Sasha continued to explain. John could practically hear the air quotes around. The archivist? Could be, Tim replied, his voice doubtful. But I feel like those fuckers would do something themselves instead of hiding some spooky cursed bullshit in his paperwork. I know, Sasha sighed, which takes us to our last suspect. Martin, Tim finished for her. There was silence again as John felt his heart leap into his throat. Martin? Why would they suspect? I checked the CCTV footage, Sasha spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I pored over every second any of those papers were on screen. Nobody but Martin and John touched those papers, Tim. Tim hummed grimly, and John felt his heart drop from his throat into his guts. He wanted to scream at them, tell them they were wrong, that it was Elias. He wanted to beg them to listen. He wanted to tell them how Elias wasn't human, how he could trick the cameras. He needed them to know it wasn't Martin, even if the evidence pointed against him. Do you think it was an accident? Tim asked, his voice flat. And John couldn't tell if it was because he simply didn't want to believe it, or if he was trying to eliminate any doubt. He worked in the library for 10 years, Tim, Sasha replied. Yeah, so no, Tim sighed. But why? I thought he cared about John. Maybe it's a ploy, Sasha suggested. It makes us less likely to suspect him. He's a great liar. More silence as John practically clawed the walls on his mind, trying to desperately yell at them, and tell them they were wrong, desperate to explain and defend. They couldn't do this. They couldn't turn on each other. They didn't know what John knew. They didn't know things were going to get so much worse. They didn't know how much they needed each other. But John did, and he wanted to scream and cry in horror as Tim and Sasha spoke. Maybe, Tim considered the possibility. Still, Sasha said, we don't know what his motive was. Maybe it wasn't even him. I prefer they not be alone together until we know for sure, Tim hummed. Agreed. The room was quiet as John tried to wake himself up fully so he could explain everything to Tim and Sasha, so he could tell them that Martin was innocent and that they loved each other more than anything in the world. But what? What was he supposed to say? He couldn't tell them the truth. Nothing he could say without telling them the truth would make sense, or worse, it would sound weirdly cryptic and would inevitably lead to him telling them way too much. He couldn't tell them anything. He couldn't tell them that it was Elias and why. He would have to convince them to trust Martin without telling them anything. But what could he do? How could he rebel trust in a way that wasn't weird or suspicious? Fucking hell, this was a disaster. The only thing he could think of that might even remotely work would be to take the first step himself. John finally managed to reach the surface, and he gasped and coughed, trembling slightly. Sasha and Tim burst from their seats and rushed his side. Hey, boss man, how are you feeling? Tim asked. Do you need water? Are you in pain? Sasha fretted as John finally managed to pry his eyes open. They both looked awful. Their clothes were disheveled, and there were bags under their bloodshot eyes. Their expressions were a mix of concern and relief as John tried to focus on them. John opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a croak followed by a coughing fit. Tim helped him up as he coughed, supporting him as Sasha grabbed a glass of water and held it to John's lips. He shakily touched the glass, trying to take it, but they both knew he was far too weak. He gulped down the water, the cool liquid soothing his throat. He coughed a couple of times into the glass, but kept drinking until it was drained. He panted and sighed when it was finally done, and Tim helped lower him back into bed. Better? He asked. Yes, John replied, coughing. He looked around and, as expected, only found Tim and Sasha in the room. But where's Martin? Georgie took him back to her flat an hour ago to eat and take a shower, Sasha explained. It was actually the first time he left your side since we've been here. She quirked her lip up in a teasing smile. He's going to be so upset you woke up when he wasn't here. Bruh, he coughed. Probably. He glanced at Tim and found that, instead of Tim grinning and preparing to joke around with him more, she just looked pensively at the door. It was closed off and wary. John hated it. He wanted to prevent Tim from descending into anger this time around, but instead, it seemed he was the cause of it yet again. How did he always manage to feel the people important to him so consistently? I'm really happy you're awake, John. Sasha gave his right hand a squeeze. We were really scared we were worried. How? A week, Tim told him. The doctors weren't sure you were going to make it the first night. They asked us to contact your family so they could say goodbye. John cringed. Your nan didn't pick up when we called her, Tim scowled. We left voicemails that you were in the hospital, but she never called back. She's dead, John said lamely, and both Sasha and Tim spun on him in an instant. She's dead? Sasha exclaimed, and John nodded. Why do you have your dead nan as your emergency contact? Tim asked incredulously. Fuck's sake, John. I was cursing your dead grandmother for a week. Tim looked up to the sky and clasped his hands. Sorry, Mrs. Sims. And Tim lightened up a bit, grinning at him. It made John glad. He liked it when Tim joked. How long ago did she die? Sasha asked. A few years ago. And you didn't update your emergency contact, Sasha scowled. I know self-care is an alien term to the Johnson Sims vocabulary, but that's just plain irresponsible, John. He looked away. I didn't update it because Because? Sasha crossed her arms. There wasn't anyone to update it to. John didn't meet her eyes. And just like that, any and all levity that had been in the room was sucked right back out of it. John refused to meet their eyes. more than a little embarrassed at the admission. It wouldn't be a problem for very much longer soon. He could update the contact to Martin, and after that, he wouldn't even need an emergency contact anymore. All he'd need to do would be eat some innocent person's trauma, and he'd be right as rain. Good Lord. I'm going to put myself as your emergency contact, Tim announced. You don't. I'm putting myself as your emergency contact, Tim repeated himself, leaving no room for argument. I'll be secondary, Sasha agreed. I suppose Martin would be my third then? Tim and Sasha exchanged a glance. Sure, Sasha replied, smiling even as her voice was a bit tight. John internally cringed. This was going to be difficult. The door opened and Georgie and Martin shuffled in. Sorry we're a bit late, Martin spoke. Georgie insisted Martin's eyes widened as he saw John sitting up in bed staring at him. Martin looked awful, truly awful. Whatever self-care Georgie had forced on him barely even scratched the surface of Martin's exhaustion. Even so, it seemed like months' worth of crushing fatigue evaporated in moments as Martin's entire body lit up. John! He cried as he rushed forward and wrapped John in his arms. John gasped as he was nearly crushed in Martin's grip. Then he relaxed and melted into his love's arms, something deep in his chest settling and healing as he breathed in Martin's warm presence all around him. Martin pressed a kiss to the top of his head as his body shuddered. Never scare me like that again. I'll try not to, John laughed as he wrapped his arm around Martin, finding his left arm almost entirely unresponsive. That sent a bolt of panic into him. Then he smothered it with the feeling of being smothered in Martin's arms. Finally, Martin let him go and settled him back down. Georgie peeked around Martin's shoulder, grinning. Hey, John. I'm really glad to see you're alive. John gave her a weak smile back. I'm glad to see you too, Georgie. Thank you for taking care of Martin for me. Don't worry about it, she waved him off. John glanced back at Tim and Sasha. Sasha smiled as she stood next to Tim, her smile only slightly faker than it normally was, which was considerably better than Tim's, as he seemed barely able to restrain himself from glorying at Martin. How glad John was to see Martin made Tim even angrier at the possibility that it was Martin who had put him in here in the first place. This was going downhill. Now or never. John shifted awkwardly. I wanted to, talk to you all about something. What is it, John? Sasha asked. John trailed off as he put his hand to his mouth, trying to figure out how to phrase what he was trying to say. Everything that's been happening recently. I think it's quite obvious now that there are things working against us. They want to hurt us. What told you that? Tim teased. The evil murder worms, Mr. Knife Hands, and the spooky death pages. Martin visibly flinched and bent his head down. Georgie put a hand on Martin's shoulder. All of them, really. John glanced between Martin and Georgie, then at the rest of the group. Something was going on that he didn't know about yet. That's why I think it's important we stick together and trust each other. Personally, I think you should quit. All of you, Georgie piped up, and John cringed. He still had no idea how to combat that argument. I don't think it's going to be that easy, Tim frowned. Whatever these things are, they're interested in John. I bet even if we did quit, they'd still be after him. At least in the archives, we have access to material that can help us research whatever comes after us, Sasha added. Georgie frowned. That's damn right. John nodded, relief and panic swirling around his body so quickly he felt lightheaded. We're a team. I trust all of you. So Everyone stared at him as they waited for him to continue. God, he really didn't want to talk about this, but it was important. It would help them. It would help them trust and understand, and more importantly, it would tell them of the existence of the web. It would help prepare them, and hopefully, it would set the stage for them to become closer. I wanted to tell all four of you about why I wound up joining the Institute in the first place. About my first encounter with the supernatural, in the form of a lightener called a guest Mr. Spider,